Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of the AnthroPuzzled podcast. I'm your host, Abby Letzinger, and every 2 weeks we'll explore how anthropologists are forging unique career paths beyond the usual academic sphere. Tune in, get inspired, and start piecing together your own career puzzle within the world of anthropology. On today's episode, we have Eric Shattuck. He graduated from Indiana University, Bloomington with a PhD in biological anthropology and is currently an assistant professor at Florida State University. How are you doing today, Eric?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great as well. So what is it that you currently do, and what was your research in, and why is it important in terms of anthropology?
Okay. What do I currently do? So a lot. like any professor, any assistant professor, we do a lot of stuff, right? So I'm teaching. I've been at FSU now for just about 2 years, maybe a little bit over right now. But the last semester I was on parental leave. So I've kind of been over the last few weeks kind of coming back from parental leave and getting myself in the groove for the new semester. Here at FSU, I teach courses on human variation, adaptability, human evolution, One health, so the intersection of human, animal, and environment health. When I teach it, it really focuses a lot on infectious disease because that's kind of my happy place, maybe for lack of a better term. My research is primarily focused, again, kind of on infectious disease, but health more broadly. I try to bring things back to infection when I can. My work is also dealing with a field or concept that I'm calling social immunology, which is essentially how our social worlds, including potentially the cultures that we find ourselves in, get under the skin, as the saying goes, and influence our health, specifically our actual immune function. There's a lot of science out there on how these things influence things like inflammation. And so you see markers like CRP or interleukin-6 or something like that, right? And that's all well and good and super interesting. But I'm curious to see if there's a connection from inflammation, which is absolutely part of the immune system and part of immune function, but actually looking into see if these things influence our ability to fight off infection, if these things shape who gets sick, how often they get sick, how severe those illnesses are, and so on. And there's some evidence from other fields that, for instance, your social network size and the quality of those social relationships can influence your ability to mount an effective antibody response to the flu vaccine. So maybe those individuals who are in relatively small social networks and maybe the relationships aren't spectacular, may find themselves at a little bit of a disadvantage when it comes to being vaccinated and fighting off the flu. So that's kind of like the big overarching picture of what my research does and what I'm trying to get at. Another aspect that I focus on is sickness behavior. So this is what my dissertation was on and what a lot of my work since then has been on. And this is simply our body's behavioral response to infection. You've had a cold, you may have had COVID, you may have had a flu. I've certainly had all of the above. We all have, all your audience, I'm sure, has. And if you think back to the last time you were sick with something like that, my guess is that you had a very stereotypical reaction. You became socially withdrawn. You became lethargic. Your dietary preferences changed. All of this is very stereotypical, not only in humans, but in other non-human animals. And collectively, this is called sickness behavior. The idea is that it's a energetic reprioritization, change in motivation to mounting a effective immune response. Mounting an immune response is energetically costly, but so are things like social behaviors. So are things like, in the case of non-human animals, childcare. Well, childcare is also energetically expensive for humans too, right? But the science that I'm referring to comes a lot from non-human animals, from rodent models and stuff like that. At any rate, when we're sick, then the assumption is that the energy is better spent on mounting that immune response. And so all these other kinds of behaviors and even mood and stuff like that shifts in order to mount that immune response. So one of the things I've been curious about is, okay, well, if this is something that is really widespread throughout a variety of different taxa, do we see it in all human populations? And so I've been starting to work with various groups to try to explore the parameters of sickness behavior outside of the US? And then is it the case that sickness behavior is understood everywhere the same, that it serves as an indication of sickness? I think for a lot of us, when we start feeling that way, when we start feeling super lethargic and everything like that, that's kind of a big cue that like, ooh, maybe I'm coming down with something. Is that the case around the world? And then do we respond to these things the same, right? For some of us, it's relatively easy to stay home from work, take a day off, take a sick day, right? But that's not the case for everybody. Some people don't have paid sick leave. Some people don't have childcare, whatever that may be, right? So what are the kind of parameters that go into the decisions that we each make individually about when to sort of act on the sickness behavior, rest, recuperate, versus not, right? To ignore it, or maybe not ignore it, but at least kind of push through it, right? Because, we have these things that we're kind of compelled to do: jobs, childcare, family care, whatever that may be, right? But then also are there cultural aspects of this too? So things like stoicism, for instance, right? So people who perceive themselves to be pretty stoic and tough and things like this, are they more apt to kind of push through this thing, push through sickness behavior? And then what are the consequences of that, right? Is it the case that people who do that, are they doing themselves a disservice? Are they more likely to feel worse? Is the sickness going to last longer? But then, of course, there's major implications for pathogen transmission, right? If they're going to work, if they're going to school, they're certainly spreading it around, right? And then there's a bunch of other projects I'm involved in besides that we could maybe talk about a little bit later, but those are kind of the big kind of overarching questions and tracks that my research is taking. And then you asked, why is it important for anthropology? On the one hand, I think the social immunology stuff is potentially can help us understand variation in how and why people get sick, variation in the experiences of sickness, right? Why some people get sick more often, or why illnesses are worse for these people, and so on and so forth. Theoretically, there could be interventions that could be designed around that, right? I'm thinking of things like social prescribing, which is what you see in places like the UK, where doctors actually recommend that patients go and do cultural events, go to a movie, join a group and go do some activities, right? Because there's this recognition that mental health plays a role in physical health and so on. And, being engaged in these kinds of activities is beneficial for your health, for stress, and so on and so forth. Could we do something similar where we say, well, hey, go hang out with some friends. If you had the flu shot, maybe go hang out with some friends and, enjoy those social kinds of relationships and things like that. And maybe that influences your health a little bit. I'm not trying to say that, this is going to determine whether or not somebody ever gets sick or anything like that. The effect of all of this may be relatively small, but even still, I think when we start paying attention to these small effects, we understand more about our biology and about our health, but then we also potentially understand more about how we can treat and help boost our own immune systems potentially. The sickness behavior stuff too, there's a lot of work in anthropology that's done in medical anthropology and things like this, on things like illness behavior and the decisions that people make when they get sick, how illnesses redefine how we think of ourselves and so on. But a lot of this research has come from chronic illnesses, HIV, TB, MS, these large, impactful illnesses and diseases, right? Where anthropology hasn't spent a lot of time, at least, over the last few decades, certainly, has been with these kinds of almost day-to-day illnesses, flus, colds, and maybe we can even roll COVID into that right now, right? But while they may not have quite the impact on your life as a tuberculosis diagnosis or an HIV diagnosis or something like that. Yeah, absolutely. But the fact is that we experience these things repeatedly throughout our lives, right? We have, I think the numbers are something like 2 to 4 colds per year on average in the US, right? Flu puts people in hospital. Flu can kill people, right? It can be fatal, just like TB, just like HIV, COVID, of course, the same thing. But we have this idea in our head, here in the US at least, that these illnesses are not really that big of a deal. I don't really need to stay home. It's just the flu. It's just COVID. It's just cold, whatever it is, right? That's not the case for some of these things, flu and COVID for sure. But even if it is disruptive, it can still really affect our day-to-day lives for a week, right? These things kind of last, 5, 8, 10 days, whatever. That's, 5, 8, 10 days where you need help with childcare because you're, really laid up, or you have to take sick leave if you have it, right? All of these kinds of things. And so I think there's a lot of room for anthropologists to be asking these kinds of questions about these illnesses that in many cases we consider to be pretty benign when in fact they're not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. Because I've noticed, especially when COVID happened, how people treated being sick and not being sick was very much different in other countries than it was here. Because over in Asia, a lot of individuals, they tend to wear masks regardless, whether they're sick or not, because they want to protect themselves, their family members. Here in the US, we're more individualistic, where they're more community centered. And you could definitely see that because when COVID happened over there, they're like, yep, everybody mask up. We're going to go on lockdown. We're going to do what we can to protect those who can't protect themselves, like kids, those with autoimmune diseases, the elderly, that kind of stuff. And then you have the other side of the coin over here in the US, where people are like, no, that's an infringement of my rights and I should be able to do whatever I want and yada, yada, yada. It's very me, me, me. I don't care about my neighbors. So do you feel that there are cultural beliefs or practices that inadvertently help or hinder individuals' immune systems or just a community's immune system?
Well, that's a great question. I think that a lot of this probably boils down to, and it's kind of this double-edged sword if you think about it, right? You kind of hit the nail on the head when you talk about individualism versus what has been called collectivism. There's a bunch of different terms for it. Maybe collectivism isn't the best term, but if it is the case that, having these really strong, meaningful social connections are beneficial to us, and I think they are on many levels, right? We can think about mental health. And like I mentioned before, we can even think about physical health in terms of, even in this one instance, your antibody response to a vaccination. I think this is probably the case. This goes back to, throughout human evolution. I think this almost universally, right? People need other people, right? That can come with its own downsides, of course, but for the most part, we're incredibly social beings. We're incredibly social animals. And I think to some extent, we fundamentally need that for our own kind of health and well-being, right? So maybe there is some cost to the kind of individualistic societies that we see. You mentioned the US. Sure, absolutely right. On the other hand, though, if you think about communicable illnesses, being around a lot of people a lot of times is going to potentially come with that cost of increased disease transmission, right? So there's this really interesting, it's something I'd love to try to be able to tease out. There's this interesting kind of interplay with where on the one hand, you're in some really great social networks and you have this very vibrant social life and everything else like that. But on the other hand, if anybody in that circle gets sick, it very much could go around. Or, are people a little bit more able to fight it off because, again, they have those close social bonds. They have that kind of mental health, physical health benefit. I'm not really sure. But again, something really interesting to kind of look at.
When I was a kid, my brother got the chicken pox. And my mom was like, you go touch your sister so they can also get the chicken pox and just go through it in one round. And after going through that experience, I would have much rather been vaccinated for it. So I would have never had to go through it to begin with. But I think that's something that, especially I have friends who are teachers and like every year they get sick like 3 or 4 times during the year. It's because they're interacting with all these individuals who have different germs and antibodies and what kind of stuff. But I feel like in those cases, sometimes it does build up the immune system when you're interacting with all these different individuals who have all these different kind of germs, because if you keep yourself isolated or only interact with the same individuals every day, you're never going to be exposed to something new. And granted, being exposed to something new might not be a great experience. I think like in the long run, evolutionary, I feel like that builds up a better immune system than just being stuck in a bubble your whole life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I know that there's some thought about that in terms of COVID, right? With the kids that, were kept fairly isolated early on in life, right? Whether or not they have immunological debt or something like that, I think. But I haven't followed that argument well enough to really be able to say one way or the other, right? But yeah, I mean, that's what the immune system does, right? You come into contact with something and your body responds to it. And most of the time it does it really well because, I'm convinced that, we come into contact with way more pathogens than we ever get sick with. But sometimes you're not able to fight it off, right? For whatever reason that is, right? You're too close to somebody, you get too much of such a high infectious dose, your antibodies aren't quite up to snuff, whatever it may be, right? But yeah, I mean, the immune system is designed to be around a bunch of pathogens, right? For better or worse.
Yeah, exactly. And I definitely feel like there's cultural differences between how we handle being sick over here and how they do it in other countries. Because here, it's work-life balance is really difficult over here because even when I would get sick, I'm just like, I can't not go to work because one, I got bills to pay, but also I don't have sick pay, paid time off, anything like that. So if I don't go to work, then my paycheck is going to be less than what I can afford. But then you have the other side of the coin and be like, well, I don't want to get anybody else sick because someone might be in a worse situation where I am where they like literally can't take a day off. But I feel like it's also this mindset of like employers that if you miss a day from being sick or whatever, there's a very much chance where they're like, you're not dedicated to your job if you can't, like, it can't be that bad, or you have to get a doctor's note. And with the health care and insurance here, like, I can't afford to go to the doctor just to get a doctor's note. Like, that's a $100 or $200 doctor's note. Like, if I feel bad, I'd rather just stay home and like write it out. But I feel like, I think that's something as a country in a whole we need to work on, because I feel like people shouldn't be scared to like stay home and like worry about their job if they get sick and they can't come in, because there's been plenty of times where people have come in sick and the next day they're like, so I have COVID, and I'm like, go away.
Yeah.
So I definitely think culture influences whether or not someone seeks medical help as well for that.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I wish I could say that, now after COVID, quote unquote, after, because it's still there, right?
Mm-hmm.
But after COVID, I wish I could say that we as a country have learned our lesson, right? And have made it easier for people to stay home or whatever it is, work from home. But I don't think that's the case. You see this with the kind of return to the office pushes. I don't know. I don't have any like concrete data to say that, sick leave policies haven't changed or anything like that. But I mean, I just think just kind of anecdotally, I don't think you're really seeing that. And even at, from kind of a capitalistic sense, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me because, okay, so you have some workers who come in with COVID or flu or cold or whatever it may be. The odds are that's going to spread around. And then instead of one person being out sick for a week, you now have multiple people who are going to be out sick, right? Or I don't know if they're in a customer facing, customer service kind of thing, they get a customer sick or something like that. People don't want to come to your shop, right? Because they've been getting sick when they go there. So yeah, it's this weird kind of, if you look at it from a dollars and cents perspective, I would think that the bottom line would say, hey, just stay home. It's cheaper in the long run. And that's where, I think you hit the nail on the head exactly. It's this cultural aspect of it, right? Of like, okay, well, yeah, maybe it's cheaper for Eric to stay home sick or something like that. But does that mean that he's not fully dedicated to his job and so on and so forth? One example that I like to give when I talk about this stuff is, so presenteeism is the phenomenon, right, of going to work when you're sick. Mm-hmm. Presenteeism happens in every industry, but it also happens in medical professionals and at rates that are about the same with people in any other industry, right? Really wide range, depends on the kind of study you're looking at. But, what is it? Anywhere from 40 to 97% of people have reported going to work when they've been sick across a variety of industries, and the same range of numbers for medical professionals. Medical professionals are interesting to me because these are the people who should know better, who do know better, right? And they're the people who treat this stuff. So on the one hand, you could say, well, okay, but they know their body, they know the symptoms. They know like when's that limit, and so maybe they go to work. They're feeling a little bit under the weather. They've got some symptoms, but they figure it's okay, right? Maybe, but there's at least one study out there showing that there was a flu outbreak on a cancer ward that could be traced back to somebody coming to work when they were sick, right? Not a place where you want to have a flu outbreak. And so when you do this kind of research, myself and others have done this, you look at, okay, well, what are these people saying about why they do this, right? And it varies depending on when you ask. So I think, pre-COVID, there's maybe a little bit of a shift to post-COVID and, the kinds of people, the kinds of medical professionals you're talking to, but there's a little bit of a signal for culture, right? So in a couple studies, there's been things like, well, this is kind of what doctors do, right? There's this kind of idea about the self-sacrificing doctor that needs to go into work and everything else like that, fight against the odds to save patients. A not insignificant number of times, though, they also mention the working conditions, right? The fact that there's just not enough coverage. And this is, I think, especially what you see post-COVID, right? With a lot of the healthcare workers that left nurses and so on because of the working conditions, the burnout and everything else like that. There's just not enough coverage. And that's not great, right? Because the last people you would want to come to work when they're sick are the people who are going to be around people who are already sick, who are immunocompromised, who have pre-existing conditions and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely this interesting mix of, in this case in particular, some of these cultural ideas about, what a doctor is and should be doing and so on, versus also what are the kind of structural aspects of their jobs that in many cases are preventing them from actually taking the time off.
Yeah. Are there any misconceptions that you think the public has about immunity and behavior that you'd want to debunk?
Oh, wow. That's a great question, Matt. Immunity behavior I didn't want people to debunk. I'm trying to think. The only thing that kind of comes to mind, because we're kind of talking about this, right, is this idea that, well, these things aren't that big of a deal, that a cold is just a cold, it's just some sniffles, just get over it, or, the flu or the COVID, whatever this may be. I mentioned before that, flu does still kill people. COVID does still kill people. And even if the people that you come into contact with are not at particular risk, right, they're not necessarily very young or very old, they don't necessarily have pre-existing conditions, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. These things are still impactful. Nobody wants to get sick, right? So no matter how minor you think these things are, I mean, what does it cost? Well, I get, I say this, what does it cost you to just stay home for a few days? What does it cost you to put a mask on? A mask, it doesn't cost anything, right? There's no kind of monetary cost, but beyond the cost of the mask, of course, but there's no kind of drawback to this. Staying home, yeah, I get it. I get that some people may not be able to stay home. Some people may not be able to take the time. They have all these commitments that they can't get away from. I completely get it. I've been there myself. But just being able to rest and relax and recuperate and be by yourself or have your family help you out when you can is probably going to get you back on your feet that much faster. It's going to keep other people from getting sick. And there's also a need, I think, to kind of fight for meaningful sick leave in this country, in the US. Other countries have it, right? It's okay. They can take the time off. It's not a big deal. But here in the US, we have, as we've kind of been talking about, on the one hand, we have these kinds of cultural ideas about what's right or proper to do when you're sick, which may include even going to work because, it's not that big of a deal, whatever it may be. But there's also these kinds of structural factors. Much harder to kind of change culture. Maybe easier. I'm not sure to change these kinds of structural factors. But, I don't know, to the extent that you can try to change the culture of sick leave in your workplaces and so on, I think would go a long way and also help with the next pandemic. We lived through one. There's going to be more. And I'm concerned about the next ones because we in the US at any rate have kind of shown how unwilling we are to make the kinds of behavioral changes that prevent transmission, right? So maybe we can start laying the groundwork. Fingers crossed. I'm skeptical, but I'm also optimistic at the same time, I guess.
Yeah, learn from our mistakes this first time around and hope that it doesn't happen again. But, there's so many people on this planet that another pandemic, it's not if a pandemic happens, it's when another pandemic happens. But I'm hoping they learn from the mistakes they made this time. And I think that a lot of the reasons why there was so much pushback was because they weren't prepared for this one in a way that they should have been. So because they were constantly changing the protocols and the procedures, people are like, you don't know what you're talking about. None of what you're saying is factual. Like, wear a mask, don't wear a mask, be 20 feet, actually needs to be more than 20 feet. And so when you get a lot of information like that doesn't match up, people are like, you guys obviously don't know how to handle this, so we're just going to do whatever we want. And in the future, we're not going to listen to you, which is super sad. But I feel like that's the kind of the importance of researchers and scientists is, science isn't always right. And it's always evolving and changing with the more information that we provide. So just because they had a different stance one day and now it's a different stance a new day, they might have just gotten new information. And some people are like, you just changed your mind for shits and giggles. And I'm like, no, that's not how that works. So yeah, hopefully there's enough documentation and research done into how people react to this time to hopefully prevent something from happening like that again. Now, I know we've touched on a little bit, but like what kind of led you into wanting to study like evolutionary medicine and immunology?
Mhm. Yeah, it's interesting because when I grew up, all of my family were like medical professionals or military, sometimes both, right? So like my aunt was pediatrician, but was also, in the Air Force Reserve and so on. My grandma was an ER nurse. And I remember when I was a kid, just, hearing the worst stories, particularly for my grandma. Of course, she's seeing a lot of blood and guts and gore in the ER and just being really turned off from the idea of, medicine and everything, blood and all that stuff, icky. And so I went a completely kind of different route. In my undergraduate was all cultural anthropology and, nothing to do with health. But I took a class in undergraduate that included a book on evolutionary medicine, and it was Why We Get Sick by Nessie and Williams. And I just absolutely loved it. Just the ideas that were outlined in that book. It was, God bless me, it was ever in 1994, if I remember right. So it's been, oh my God, 30 years. But 30 years ago, the kind of thinking was remarkable, and it opened up new avenues to thinking about disease and health and everything like this, and just really, really made an impression on me. And I found myself kind of going back to that book and back to that way of thinking and thinking a lot about pathogenicity and virulence for diseases and why some are more virulent than others and so on, right? So, the idea of adaptive severity and things like this that, depending on the route you take as a pathogen, your virulence could be higher or lower, right? You can do more or less damage to your host. Right. So if something is transmitted person to person, on average, virulence is relatively low because you don't want your host to be laid out on the couch, right? Because then you're not being transmitted. On the other hand, if you're something that's transmitted by mosquito or by water or blood or something like that, you can afford to be more virulent. All these kinds of things. And I got really fascinated in how the idea that some pathogens or parasites even can manipulate host behavior to favor their spread. And you see this a lot in insects, where parasites can influence their behavior and make them do things, fairly suicidal things that, really bad for the host, really great for the parasite. And so I wanted to kind of explore this idea in humans. And so as part of my master's work, we did a project using the flu vaccine and asking, is it the case that people after receiving the flu vaccine, are they more social and so on? They were. The idea was, hey, maybe this is something inherent to the flu virus, because the vaccine is a dead form of the virus. Maybe there's something there that's still, able to kind of tweak our brain chemistry a little bit, make us a little bit more social. But at the same time, it could also be just a placebo effect, right? Or not necessarily a placebo effect, but a feeling of being healthier and more protected because you've had the flu vaccine, right? So like, hey, I've had my flu shot. I'm going to go out and hang out with folks. I'm protected. I'm safe. What we weren't able to do with that study was look at any kind of biological mechanism, right? So I got really interested in, okay, but if these pathogens can do this, if these parasites can do this, manipulate host behavior, how in the hell can they do this when they're a little virus or a worm or whatever? What is going on here? And kind of reading up on that took me down this rabbit hole of sickness behavior. So the pathogens themselves don't manipulate behavior and sickness behavior. It's the inflammation, right? But that is a way for the immune system to communicate with the brain, right? And to affect behavioral changes. There may also be a role for hormones like cortisol, testosterone, things like this that may also fluctuate when we're sick. So this question of the mechanism behind pathogen manipulation of host behavior is kind of what led me to sickness behavior. And then that as a model for understanding how sickness, how pathogens, how the immune system more specifically influences behavior is kind of what took me into the kind of immunological route and brought me to where I am today.
Nice. I give mad props to anybody who can study diseases or go into the medical field. I don't have the stomach for it at all. I went to a sports medicine camp once when I was in high school, and they were showing pictures of injuries because you have to know the injuries in order to how to treat them. I'm like, nope, just turn my whole desk around. I'm like, I can't look at this. Now, I do have a question about flu shots. So I have never had a flu shot, and that is due to one of my parents being very anti-vax. The reason I haven't gotten flu vaccines since leaving home is that my concern is because I've never had it before, I'm going to get really sick when I do get it. Now, is that something that happens often, or is that just kind of like a overthinking and like insecurity thing?
For sure. No, it can happen, certainly. My wife, for instance, we are both up to date on our COVID boosters, and I don't remember if we had to get one when she was pregnant, but we certainly did both, you know. But for her, the COVID shot always makes her feel terrible, right? For other people, less so. Myself, I've had a couple shots. I think maybe one of the COVID ones, maybe some other one where I've been, I won't say knocked down, but certainly you can feel it, right? But that's kind of a good thing in some ways, right? That's that immune response that you want to see. That's the inflammation that you want to see. It's a good thing. It's inconvenient at the time, of course it is, right? But 24 hours of feeling kind of under the weather and kind of shitty versus a week.
That's definitely fair. Because I know when I got my COVID vaccine, I had like body aches for like 2 days. And it didn't help that we were in the middle of moving too. So like having to carry big furniture. I'm like, I'm just going to lay in the driveway real quick because it's nice and hot out and this helps. But I know that a lot of individuals, you know, who don't get vaccinated, whether they're like their body physically can't handle getting vaccinated. And then there's the individuals who just choose not to. I feel like that also plays a role in culture because I feel like a lot of people mention like herd mentality of, you know, if enough people get vaccinated, then I don't have to get vaccinated. And it's like, well, you know, I feel like people who can get vaccinated should to protect those who cannot.
Absolutely.
But, you know, there's also the people who have really bad reactions to vaccinations. But the way I look at those kind of things is, you know, it's almost as if it's an allergic response. They're obviously allergic to something that's in the vaccine. It doesn't mean the vaccine is inherently bad. It's not like if some kid was allergic to peanuts, you're not going to throw out all peanuts in the world. You know, they're just happen to be, their body's like, I don't like this. So when individuals use that kind of thinking against vaccines and why a lot of people shouldn't get it, it kind of just makes me wonder about the, you know, education of medicine in our country, because I feel like that's something we're not taught a lot about is medicine in general. We kind of just hope and trust that our doctors know the best without doing any research of our own. And I think that's definitely something that needs to change in the future going forward, because it doesn't seem like the medical field, especially because it's so capitalistic, that's not taking our best interests and health in mind anymore. It's just to make a pretty penny.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I mean, you mentioned not doing, you know, kind of putting faith in doctors, not doing research. I wonder if that's the case anymore. Certainly, you know, pre-internet, sure, right? And there was always, and I think in the U.S., doctors still have that kind of cultural cachet, right? Of like, oh, you're a doctor. On average, I think most people would trust what a doctor says and so on. I think there's some surveys out there that show this kind of thing. But I think that's also taken a hit, especially post-COVID, right? And I think for scientists, it absolutely has. So I'm trying to think of some of these surveys. I'd have to go dig them up. But, you know, they made the rounds on social media not that long ago where, you know, broken down by political party affiliation, you know, such and such percentage of Republicans pre-COVID trusted, you know, what a scientist, just generic scientists would say, versus such and such percentage of Democrats. And then you can see these shifts post-COVID where, you know, I am probably misremembering this, but, you know, I don't think the Democratic numbers shifted that much. Maybe they went up a little bit, right? But post-COVID, the numbers for Republican identifying people, trusting scientists, again, just general, we're not talking Fauci, just general scientists, decreased, right? And you have access to the internet. And so you have a lot of people, I think, doing their own research for a lot of this stuff. And that's where, on the one hand, you know, I think, yeah, people should be informed. People should know about these kinds of things. People should be educated about what a vaccine is, what a vaccine does, or, you know, what chemotherapy, whatever it is, right? Yeah, absolutely. Be informed, be knowledgeable. But on the other hand, there's a lot of sources in big quotes, right? There's a lot of sources out there that people are reading that aren't scientifically accurate, or, you know, whatever that may be, right? And so I think we have kind of this interesting effect of like, we have a really, in some ways, very educated populace. We have access to like most of human knowledge at our fingertips in our pockets. But we also now have people who, for whatever reason, or many people are for whatever reason, kind of going down some of these, quote unquote, alternative therapies and so on, right? For some things, this may be perfectly fine. It may work. There may, a lot of, all medicine starts somewhere, right?
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's a lot of science also debunking a lot of these kinds of things. Yeah, it's interesting. And you mentioned, herd immunity as well, right? Yeah. So the idea there, right? We have a certain number of people in a population who are vaccinated, and based on the type of illness, you need to meet a certain threshold for people who are then unvaccinated for whatever reason to not encounter that sickness, right? So then that number is going to vary depending on what kind of illness you're looking at. So I think for measles, one of the most contagious diseases, right? You need something like 95% of the population to be vaccinated, right? And we're starting to see that really fall off, particularly with measles. I think, up in Canada and stuff like that, those numbers are decreasing, which means now that people who cannot get vaccinated, they have health conditions, whatever, that prevent them from being vaccinated through no choice of their own, they are now vulnerable, where a few years before they might not have been, right? Really interesting kind of shifts.
Now, do you feel that by obtaining an anthropology degree, it's kind of broadened your viewpoint and perspective on the world?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's afforded me a lot of opportunities for travel, luckily. So, in grad school and then afterwards, I've been able to travel to some really amazing places, meet some really amazing people. Even, my colleagues in the US and elsewhere, right, are absolutely fantastic people. Just being able to talk to them, bounce ideas off. It's something I absolutely love about this job, is just being able to, kind of rap with really intelligent colleagues who are traveled a lot, seen a lot, have a lot of different perspectives. And anthropology too. And for any of your listeners who are thinking about, if there's students thinking about the medical path and all these kinds of things, I really do encourage people to take anthropology classes, maybe even minor in it if possible, or double major. And I think especially for medical professionals, because our culture, how we were raised, brought up, is going to influence how we interact with medical professionals, how we think about illnesses and sicknesses and so on and so forth. And I think having some training in that is fantastic for your competency as a future medical professional. And there's a lot of really interesting research to be done out there. We've talked about some of mine, but I have colleagues doing all kinds of amazing, wonderful, cool stuff that's related to health that happens to be within anthropology, right? And, shout out to Paul Farmer, who you may know and your audience may know as well. He was an MD PhD. His PhD was in anthropology, right? And did amazing, amazing stuff with that background.
Now, is there anything we haven't discussed today that you'd still like the listeners to know about?
Oh, goodness. I'm recruiting graduate students here at FSU. So we have a master's program, but we also just reopened our PhD program. So we have our first cohort of PhD students coming in the fall. And in fact, like 2 weeks they get here. It's super exciting. So if any of the stuff we've talked about interests you and you want to know more about graduate degrees and, getting a PhD or a master's at FSU, definitely reach out and chat. And maybe I can kind of toss in some of the other projects that I'm working on that I mentioned. So working with colleagues at University of Nevada, Las Vegas on some survey work with the Hadza, which is a hunting-gathering population in Tanzania. And so we've got some data just recently published on attitudes towards vaccination in a hunting and gathering group who are undergoing, to some extent, a little bit of modernization as Tanzanian society kind of comes in, as tourism comes in, and so on and so forth. I work in Mexico as well with an indigenous group there called the Huaratica. We have a kind of growing project on Huaratica health that myself, colleagues from the US, Canada, and Mexico are working on. So we have some papers in progress right now that are coming out about sleep health, about participation in traditional ceremonies, and a feeling of connectedness to nature that is very much a part of their traditional kind of worldview and the influence that has on health. And then another project that I'm really excited about and hopefully we can kind of ramp up here pretty soon is actually tattoo flu. So if you have tattoos, you may know that very often after getting a tattoo, you can feel pretty crummy. No surprise there. It's a pretty traumatic thing that you're doing to your body. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of inflammation that comes along with it. And so what we see with tattoo flu is, I think, so anecdotally, people call tattoo flu people who have been tattoo artists talk about it a little bit. It doesn't happen to everybody. It doesn't happen for every tattoo. So there's really interesting questions about what's happening with the tattoo or with the person's biology or something like this that influences how they feel after this tattoo. But we're trying to kind of quantify it. We're trying to see to what extent tattoo flu tracks sickness behavior, because really, if it's the inflammation, it should be pretty much the same kind of thing, the lethargy, the social withdrawal, all that stuff. And then I'm interested in potentially using it as kind of a model for sickness behavior, because a lot of times when we elicit sickness behavior experimentally in humans, we're doing things in a very kind of, experimental setting, right? Where you have people in lab coats and, you have people coming into a lab, you're injecting them with something, you're making them feel pretty crummy. But this is a way to maybe look at this outside of the kind of clinical setting, right? People choosing to go in, get a tattoo. When they leave that setting, they do their normal activities, they go show off the tattoo to friends, whatever it is. The context is entirely different. So I'm kind of excited to explore that and see what we can learn about sickness using tattoos as a model, maybe.
It's actually funny you say that, because there is an episode on the Anthrobiology podcast where Gabby interviews an individual. His name's Dr. Christopher Lynn at the University of Alabama.
Yep.
And he talks about tattoos and what they can tell you about the immune system and like health signaling and all that kind of stuff, which was really a cool episode. So if anybody wants to listen to that, that one was super interesting because I have tattoos myself. So it was interesting for him to talk about how, depending on how your tattoo heals is based on like the response your immune system is having to the foreign bodies in your bloodstream or your skin and all that kind of stuff, and how it heals. And why, sometimes tattoos start rejecting, and it's because of your immune response to it. So I thought that was really cool. And I'm just like, oh my God, I've listened to an episode that sounds like that. So
yeah, well, Chris is part of this project as well, along with St. Calmellis up in South Dakota, and then a colleague of mine, Jessica Perrott, who is a psychologist at Texas State. So we've got kind of a interdisciplinary kind of group, and everybody's fantastic. Chris Lynn is wonderful, love him. And then, funnily enough, all three of them are pretty heavily tattooed, and then I have absolutely no tattoos, so I'm kind of the odd one out. I have no tattoos yet, maybe I should say.
Right. That's so cool. So what would be the best piece of advice that you would offer to someone who is interested in getting into kind of what you do and you study?
Yeah, great question. I think, be curious, look for opportunities for research. One thing that I try to always do, and I know a lot of my colleagues do this as well, is, be open to undergrads who want to do research. It's not just for graduate students. I've worked with really wonderful undergrads here at FSU who have been immeasurably helpful for, some of these projects with the Hadza in particular, right? And who have been authors on some of the papers that are coming out of this. So reach out, find somebody who's doing really interesting, cool work, reach out. We're all a bunch of nerds. We want to talk about what we do. We are excited to talk about ideas with people. Try to get yourself involved in some of these research projects, and just kind of be curious, see where it takes you. It's a big, wide world out there. There's a lot of big, interesting questions. It's going to take a lot of people a long time to work through and puzzle through and everything else like that. So there's plenty of work out there to be done.
Yeah. Are there any changes you wish to see in your industry?
Ooh, sure. Thinking about higher education, right? Things are not spectacular right now, as you know, right? With the current political climate and things like this. So, that right now at the drop of a hat would be something I wish I could change, the snap of my fingers. But even still, prior to the current administration and things like this, higher ed has been changing. There's a lot of, how can I put this? I think a lot of students, unfortunately, see higher education or have seen higher education as a means to an end, which is to say a degree and a job and a letter of recommendation. And sure, you're going to get these things and you'll earn these things and so on, right? But gosh, there's so much more out there, right? Higher education, college is a time, in my opinion, for exploring, thinking weird, wacky thoughts, vibing, for lack of a better word, I guess, right? With the people that are around you, experiencing all these different people from different places, different cultures, right? You're away from home, potentially, you're exploring, you're setting out. What an incredible time. And so I wish that I could also advise students to, hey, yeah, absolutely focus on the GPA, of course. But you know what? You want to take this class that sounds completely bonkers. It has absolutely nothing to do with your major. Sounds bonkers, but cool. I don't know, the biology of superheroes. Yeah, go do it. Whatever it is. If it sounds interesting, can make it happen, why not? Don't lose sight of the fact that this whole time, these 4 years or 3 years or 5 years, whatever it happens to be, are a chance for you to explore, learn from some of the best, brightest people in the world, experts in their fields who, like I said, we're all nerds who want to talk about this kinds of stuff. We want to bounce ideas around. We want to have fun exploring these kinds of things. Explore, right? Don't get so focused on the end result, the degree, the job, et cetera, that you miss out on these kinds of opportunities, right? Because they may never come back around. You'll probably never have the time that you did in your undergrad to take some goofy classes and, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that because it's nice that most degrees offer electives in which you can go take other classes. One of the classes that I took that was super cool, and every time I mention it, people are like, "What? You got to take that?" It's either called Rituals of the Dead or Rituals of Human Remains. So we got to learn about all these different cultures that use human remains in rituals for sacrifices or fertility and all that kind of stuff. It was just super cool because like when that stuff would pop up on like a TV show, I'd be like, I know what they're talking about. So yeah, definitely recommend because a lot of classes can become like very mundane and very just mind numbing. And sometimes it's just good to have that class that you're actually interested in to keep you going in school. Otherwise you get burnt out really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there's no guarantee too, or there's no telling where your curiosity can take you. And I see this too with a lot of students who want to do or have come into college. They want to do the pre-med. They want to go on and be a doctor. Sometimes the curiosity leads them in different directions. They decide, I'm taking some of these classes. Hey, this just isn't for me. Sometimes they take the classes and they hit a wall, right? They hit that OChem wall or the genetics wall or something. And they're like, ooh, yeah, I don't know if I can do this. But there are other fields out there. There's biological anthropology. There's public health. There are health related disciplines where you can use the biology that you can train in medically adjacent fields. You can still do research that is meaningful to human health, still have an impact, even though you're not an MD, right? It's out there.
Exactly. Now, you had mentioned already something that you love about your job. Is there another thing that you love about your job or your industry?
It's a blast to be able to work with cool people who you want to work with. I think the students as well, the energy that they can often bring in, right? The kinds of, in some ways that students haven't gone through graduate level training on research and stuff like that, right? So on the one hand, it's like, okay, yeah, fine, sure. That you don't know the difference between a t-test and a regression, whatever, right? But you also don't have those kinds of blinders on, right? So sometimes students can say some things or make some kinds of connections that are like, wow, this is really interesting, or ask a really great question that, you'd never thought of before. And it can take your research in new directions, or, you can, have the student lead, and seeing students kind of grow as well in their mastery of whatever the topic is, anthropology, or, grow their mastery of research skills is really, really fantastic. So yeah, absolutely love working with the students.
Awesome. So where can listeners learn more about you and what you do?
Sure. So I've got my webpage, ericshattuck.com, all one word. Let's see. Our lab. So the lab is Social Health and Immunology Research Lab, which abbreviates out to Shire, SHIRE. We just recently created an Instagram account for the lab. And then I do have my own Blue Sky account, which I think is at Eric Shattuck. And then those would probably be the best avenues. And then if if people want to reach out, you can always reach out over email, which is eshattuck@fsu.edu, and always happy to chat with folks.
Awesome. Well, I had a super great time chatting about all things evolutionary medicine and immunology. I feel like that's something that a lot of people don't feel like they can research about when it comes to anthropology, but I feel like that is one of the fields where you definitely can, because there's there's so many different people and so many different cultures that I think it's important to study those kind of things and how different cultures handle different things in regards to being sick, rather than it just being like a regular bioscientist. I think we add a level of perspective that a lot of people don't take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. But I'm biased.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. Well, it was great talking to you, and I look forward to hopefully chatting in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much. Look forward to it.
Awesome. You have a great rest of your day.
All right, thanks. Have a good weekend.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of AnthroPuzzled. This show was produced by me and distributed in collaboration with the American Anthropological Association. A special thanks to Cheyenne Brewer for editing the website, L. Akers for the incredible logo design, and to AnthroPuzzled's intern Fiona for the episode descriptions. The music is courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear of Sound and Picture. If you have any questions, you can reach me at abby.letzinger@anthropuzzled.com or as AnthroPuzzled on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. Until next time.